Translate this, or walk away with nothing. The sentence didn't echo loudly, but it landed heavy, like a quiet bet everyone in the room understood. Crystal glasses hovered midair, conversations dissolved into a low hush, and somewhere behind the soft jazz, you could almost hear the weight of $800 million pressing down on a single sheet of paper. The private dining room sat 40 floors above Manhattan, wrapped in glass and gold light, the skyline stretching endless and indifferent beyond it. At the center of it all was Ethan Caldwell, a billionaire CEO known for closing deals with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, his tailored navy suit sharp enough to cut through doubt, his fingers resting casually on the edge of the table, as if he already owned everything in the room. Across from him, investors leaned forward, calculating, waiting, watching for the smallest shift that might signal power changing hands. And then there was her. Naomi Carter moved quietly between them, a black waitress in a pressed uniform, her steps measured, her presence barely acknowledged except when a glass needed refilling or a plate needed clearing. To them, she was part of the background, like the music, like the lighting, like the view. Useful, invisible, forgettable. Ethan slid the document across the polished wood toward her without looking up fully, his tone calm but edged with something sharper, something deliberate. Translate this, he said, almost as if the request were beneath him, almost as if the outcome were already decided. A few of the men at the table exchanged amused glances, one of them leaning back with a quiet chuckle. You think she even knows what language that is? He murmured, not bothering to lower his voice enough to hide the assumption. Naomi stopped beside the table, the paper now in front of her, her hand hovering just above it for a fraction of a second longer than expected. The room didn't breathe. Not really. It paused, waiting for hesitation, waiting for failure, waiting for confirmation of what they already believed. She picked it up. Her eyes moved once across the page, then again, slower this time, more precise, as if she were tracing something invisible beneath the ink. The city lights flickered in the glass behind her, reflecting faintly against her expression, calm, unreadable, controlled. No one noticed the way her posture shifted. Just slightly, from service to stillness, from background to presence. Ethan leaned back in his chair, confident, patient, certain that whatever came next would reinforce the hierarchy he had built his life upon. Because in his world, intelligence had a look, power had a voice, and neither of them wore an apron. But what he didn't see, what none of them saw, was the moment the balance had already begun to tilt, not with noise, not with defiance, but with something far more dangerous. Certainty. And Naomi Carter, the woman no one had truly seen all night, was already 3 steps ahead. The silence stretched just a second too long, the kind that made people shift in their seats without knowing why. And then Naomi spoke, her voice calm, even and unmistakably precise as she began translating line by line without looking up, not stumbling, not guessing, but delivering each word with a clarity that cut through the room sharper than any raised voice ever could. And within seconds the quiet amusement that had lingered around the table started to fade, replaced first by confusion, then by something closer to disbelief as the language on the page, a dense block of legal phrasing mixed with technical terminology, unfolded effortlessly from her lips as if she had written it herself, and Ethan's fingers, which had been resting loosely on the table, tightened almost imperceptibly as he leaned forward just a fraction, his expression no longer relaxed but focused, alert, recalculating. Because this was not supposed to happen this way, not this fast, not this clean, and certainly not from someone he had already dismissed in his mind as irrelevant. And yet Naomi did not rush, did not perform, she simply continued, steady and controlled, her eyes scanning ahead while her voice followed without hesitation. And then, just as the last sentence seemed ready to fall into place, she paused, not because she had lost her place, but because she had found something else, something buried beneath the surface of the text. And when she spoke again, her tone shifted slightly. Not louder, not sharper, but heavier with intention as she clarified a clause that had not been obvious at first glance. A clause that changed the meaning of the entire document. And this time she did look up, not at the investors, not at the room, but directly at Ethan, holding his gaze for exactly 1 second longer than expected before finishing the translation in full. And the effect was immediate, the kind of stillness that does not come from politeness but from realization. Because what she had just revealed was not just a translation, it was an exposure, a subtle but undeniable indication that the agreement sitting on the table was not as straightforward as it had been presented, and one of the investors shifted forward, reaching for the paper, scanning the section Naomi had emphasized, his brow tightening as he read it again more carefully, slower this time, while another man adjusted his glasses and leaned in, the quiet murmur of confidence that had filled the room earlier now replaced by a growing tension that no one could ignore, and Ethan remained still, his posture controlled, his face composed, but the room could feel it, that slight fracture in certainty, that moment when control does not disappear but begins to slip, and Naomi, standing there with nothing more than a folded cloth in her hand and a tray resting at her side, did not say another word because she did not need to. The shift had already happened, the balance had already moved, and for the first time that night, the most important voice in the room belonged to the person no one had been listening to. No one spoke for a moment, not because they did not have anything to say, but because they were suddenly unsure of what was safe to say anymore. And that uncertainty settled into the room like a weight that had shifted without warning, subtle but undeniable, as the investor holding the document cleared his throat and read the clause again, slower this time, tracing each word as if expecting it to change under closer inspection, but it did not. It only became clearer, sharper, more dangerous in its implications, and he leaned back slightly, his eyes moving from the page to Ethan with a look that no longer carried blind trust but quiet concern, the kind that signals a deal is no longer secure. And another voice followed, lower, more cautious, asking for clarification on the section Naomi had pointed out, not addressing her directly, but no longer ignoring her presence either, and Ethan finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a controlled shift forward, his hand reaching for the paper. His expression composed in a way that had been practiced over years of negotiation, yet just beneath it there was something new, something tighter, more deliberate, as he scanned the lines himself, and for the first time that night, he did not speak immediately because the truth does that, it delays confidence, it interrupts certainty, and Naomi watched quietly, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, as if this moment was not unexpected, as if she had already seen how this would unfold, long before anyone else realized they were in the middle of it, and the man who had laughed earlier now sat straighter, his earlier amusement gone, replaced by a careful silence, because the hierarchy he had relied on had just been disrupted in a way he could not easily explain. And then the question came, not from Ethan, but from one of the senior investors at the far end of the table, his voice measured, direct, asking Naomi how she had caught it so quickly. And for a brief second the room shifted again, not toward power but toward curiosity, genuine and unguarded, and Naomi answered simply, without performance, without hesitation, explaining that the phrasing in that section followed a pattern often used to obscure liability in cross-border agreements, that the translation itself was accurate, but the intention behind it was not neutral, and her words did not try to impress, they clarified, they grounded the moment in something undeniable, and the effect was immediate because knowledge delivered without arrogance carries a different kind of authority, one that does not demand attention but earns it, and Ethan closed the document slowly, his gaze lifting to meet hers again, this time not dismissive, not casual, but searching, recalibrating, as if trying to understand how he had misread the most important variable in the room, and around them the skyline remained unchanged, the city lights still stretching endlessly beyond the glass, indifferent to the shift that had just taken place inside, but within that room everything had adjusted, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, because the person they had overlooked had just rewritten the direction of the conversation. And no amount of money, reputation, or expectation could reverse what had already been seen. The question lingered in the air longer than expected, not because it was complicated, but because it had shifted the rules of the room, and for the first time that evening, Naomi was no longer just responding, she was being asked, and that difference mattered even if no one said it out loud, and she answered without stepping forward, without changing her tone, explaining that certain legal structures repeat themselves across international agreements, that patterns become visible when you study enough of them, and that sometimes the most important details are the ones written to be overlooked. And her words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind that comes from experience rather than theory, and one of the investors nodded slowly, absorbing it, while another leaned back with a thoughtful expression, no longer evaluating her as staff, but as a source, as someone whose input now carried consequence, and Ethan remained quiet for a moment longer before finally speaking. His voice controlled, but different now, less performative, more precise, as he asked where she had learned to read documents like that. And it was not a challenge, not anymore, it was a question, direct and unguarded. and Naomi held his gaze briefly before answering, explaining that she had studied linguistics and international business at a state university, that she had spent years working through case studies and contracts, not because she was required to, but because she wanted to understand how power moves across borders, how meaning shifts depending on who controls the language, and she said it plainly, without embellishment, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, and for a second, the room felt smaller, not physically, but in the way perspectives narrow when assumptions collapse, because the narrative they had constructed about her no longer held, and one of the men at the table let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but not out of humor, more out of disbelief at how quickly they had misjudged the situation, and Ethan's expression shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as he leaned back, studying her not as a server, but as someone he had underestimated in a way that could have cost him more than money. And outside the glass walls the city continued its rhythm, taxis moving in steady lines, lights flickering across buildings, unaware of the recalibration happening 40 floors above. And inside that room the conversation no longer belonged to a single voice, it had opened, expanded, redirected, and Naomi, still standing with a tray at her side, did not step into the center, did not claim the moment, she simply remained where she was, composed, grounded, as if she understood something the others were only beginning to realize, that power is not always loud, not always visible, and not always where people expect to find it. And as the document rested closed on the table, no longer a symbol of certainty but of caution, the balance of the evening shifted once more, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with a quiet permanence that no one in that room could ignore. The room did not return to what it had been because once certainty cracks, it does not reseal the same way, and the shift now lingered in every glance, every movement, every careful word that followed, as one of the investors slowly rotated his glass on the table, eyes still fixed on the closed document as if it might reveal something new if he stared long enough, and another leaned forward, no longer addressing Ethan first, but directing a question toward Naomi, asking whether the clause she identified was common in high-value agreements of this scale. And again the question itself mattered more than the answer, because it confirmed what everyone now understood but had not yet said, that her perspective was no longer optional, it was necessary, and Naomi answered with the same measured calm, explaining that it was not uncommon, but it was rarely harmless, that such clauses often created leverage that could be used later, quietly, without drawing attention, and her voice remained steady, not dramatic, not accusatory, just clear, and clarity has a way of cutting through even the most carefully constructed illusions. And Ethan exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that signaled recalculation rather than defeat, as he reopened the document and scanned it again, this time not as the architect of the deal, but as someone re-evaluating its foundation, and the difference was subtle, but it was everything, because control does not disappear all at once, it shifts, it adapts, it looks for new ground to stand on, and Ethan Caldwell was not a man who lost control easily, but he was a man who recognized when the ground beneath him was no longer as stable as it appeared. And across the table the investors exchanged quieter looks now, less confident, more deliberate, as if each of them was adjusting their expectations in real time, recalculating risk, reassessing trust, and the room that had once felt like a stage now felt like a courtroom, not in tension but in scrutiny, where every word carried consequence and every silence carried meaning. And Naomi remained where she was, not stepping forward, not retreating, her presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but held it. And for the first time that evening, Ethan spoke her name, not as a command, not as a dismissal, but as acknowledgement, a single word that changed the tone of the entire interaction, and he asked her to walk him through the section again, not because he could not read it himself, but because he wanted to hear how she interpreted it. And that request, simple as it was, marked the moment the hierarchy had fully shifted, because the man who had entered the room expecting to define the outcome was now asking for guidance from the person he had overlooked. And Naomi stepped closer to the table, not rushed, not hesitant, and placed the paper between them, pointing to the exact line that mattered, explaining how a single phrase altered the responsibility structure of the agreement, how it transferred risk in a way that would only become visible later. And as she spoke, the room listened, not politely, not out of obligation, but with focus, with intent, because now they understood what was at stake, not just the deal, but the truth beneath it. And outside the glass walls the city lights continued to glow, steady and indifferent, while inside something far more important had shifted quietly into place, Something no contract could fully contain and no amount of money could override. The recognition that the person who sees clearly is often the one no one thought to look at in the first place. The explanation settled over the table like a final piece sliding into place, not dramatic, not loud, but definitive in a way that left little room for denial, and as Naomi traced the clause with quiet precision, the investors began to see what had been hidden in plain sight, how a single line could redirect responsibility months down the road, how risk could be shifted without ever being announced, and one of them leaned back, shaking his head slowly, not in confusion, but in recognition of how close they had come to signing something they did not fully understand, and another reached for his phone, not to interrupt, but to quietly pull up comparable agreements, cross-checking, confirming, validating what Naomi had just revealed with a growing sense of urgency, and Ethan watched it all unfold without interrupting, his mind moving quickly behind a controlled expression, recalibrating timelines, reassessing leverage, and most importantly, re-evaluating trust, not just in the document, but in the people who had presented it, because the foundation of any deal is not the numbers, it is the assumptions, and tonight, those assumptions had just been rewritten, and Naomi stepped back once she finished, not lingering, not waiting for recognition, her role returning outwardly to what it had been. But the room no longer allowed her to disappear into the background the way it had before, because once someone changes the direction of a conversation that carries hundreds of millions of dollars, they do not become invisible again, and one of the senior investors spoke quietly but firmly, suggesting that the signing be paused until the document could be reviewed in full, and no one disagreed, not openly, not even Ethan, because the logic was undeniable, and for a brief moment the power dynamic hovered in a delicate balance, not fully shifted away from him, but no longer entirely within his control either, and Ethan finally nodded once, a small gesture, but one that carried weight, signaling agreement, signaling restraint, signaling that even he recognized the need to step back before moving forward. And the room responded accordingly, chairs adjusting, glasses being set down, the energy shifting from celebration to analysis, from confidence to caution, and through it all Naomi remained composed, her movement steady as she resumed her work, clearing a glass here, adjusting a plate there, but now every movement carried a different meaning, not because she had changed, but because the room had, and as she passed behind Ethan's chair, he spoke again, quieter this time, asking if she had noticed anything else in the document that might require attention. And it was not a test, not anymore, it was a request for insight, and Naomi paused just long enough to answer honestly, explaining that there were a few other areas worth reviewing, nothing as immediate, but still important if the agreement was meant to hold long term. And Ethan listened, not interrupting, not dismissing, and in that moment the transformation was complete, not in a dramatic declaration, but in a quiet understanding shared across the table, that authority had shifted not through force, not through status, but through clarity, and that clarity now belonged to the one person they had almost ignored entirely. The energy in the room did not return to celebration, it evolved into something sharper, more deliberate, as if every person present had silently agreed that this was no longer just a dinner, it was a moment that would define decisions far beyond the walls around them, and the quiet clink of glass against table no longer sounded casual, it sounded measured, intentional, like every movement now carried weight, and Ethan remained seated, his posture composed, but his attention no longer scattered. Across the table it stayed anchored, focused, recalibrated, and for a man known for controlling outcomes, this shift did not weaken him, it revealed something else, something rarer, the ability to recognize when control must change form, and he turned slightly in his chair, watching Naomi as she moved toward the service station, not to call her back immediately but to observe, to understand the person who had altered the trajectory of an $800 million conversation without raising her voice once. And across the table one of the investors spoke again, this time with a tone that carried quiet respect, suggesting that they bring in legal counsel for a deeper review before proceeding, and the others nodded, not reluctantly but in alignment, because the illusion of certainty had already been replaced by the reality of risk, and no one in that room was willing to ignore it now. And when Naomi returned, placing a fresh glass of water near Ethan's hand, he did not look past her the way he had earlier, he looked directly at her, his expression steady, his voice lower, more grounded, as he asked a question that was no longer about the document, but about her, asking why she had chosen to work here if she clearly understood a world far beyond it, And the question was not sharp, not judgmental, it was genuine, and Naomi paused for a brief moment, not because she was unsure, but because she chose her words carefully, explaining that understanding a system is different from being accepted by it, that sometimes access comes through unexpected doors, and that she had learned more observing people in rooms like this than she ever could from the outside. And her answer did not challenge anyone directly, but it landed with quiet force because it reflected something deeper than the conversation itself, something about perception, about opportunity, about who gets seen and who does not, and Ethan listened without interrupting, his gaze steady, absorbing not just her words, but what they implied, and for a brief second the room seemed to hold that truth in silence, not uncomfortable but reflective, as if everyone present recognized a piece of it within their own experience. And then Ethan gave a small nod, not exaggerated, not performative but sincere, and turned back to the table, signaling that the meeting would continue, but under new terms with new awareness, and Naomi stepped back once more, returning to her role outwardly, but the shift had already taken root, because she was no longer invisible, not in that room, not in that moment, and as the skyline outside continued to glow with indifferent brilliance, inside, something far more significant had already been rewritten, quietly, precisely, and in a way that none of them would forget. The meeting did not end with a signature, it ended with a decision to wait, and in a room built on speed, that alone spoke louder than any agreement ever could, as folders remained closed, pens untouched, and the quiet understanding settled in that what had almost been finalized would now be taken apart piece by piece, examined with a level of scrutiny that had not existed just an hour earlier, and as the investors began discussing next steps in lower, more deliberate tones, the dynamic had fully shifted from performance to precision, from confidence to caution, and Ethan stood slowly from his chair, not abruptly, not as a signal of frustration, but as a transition, his movements controlled, intentional, as he adjusted his jacket and looked out briefly toward the city beyond the glass, the skyline reflecting back at him in layers of light and shadow, and for a moment he said nothing, as if measuring something internal, something that did not belong to the deal itself but to the way the evening had unfolded, and then he turned back, not to the investors but toward Naomi, who was placing a final set of glasses on a nearby table, her movements unchanged, her focus steady, as if the weight of what had just happened did not require acknowledgement, and Ethan walked a few steps closer, stopping at a respectful distance, not commanding attention, not interrupting, but waiting just long enough for her to look up, and when she did, there was no hesitation in her expression, only calm awareness, and he spoke quietly, asking if she had ever considered working in a role where her skills would not be overlooked, and the question carried no arrogance, no assumption of ownership, only recognition, and Naomi listened, her posture relaxed but grounded, and she answered with the same clarity she had shown all night, explaining that she had considered many paths, that she had applied to positions where her knowledge should have been enough, but that sometimes decisions are made long before qualifications are reviewed, and her voice did not carry bitterness, only truth, the kind that does not need to be defended because it is lived, and Ethan nodded once, slowly, absorbing not just her answer but what it revealed about systems he operated within but had never fully examined from that angle. And around them the room continued to move, conversations resuming, assistants gathering notes, the evening transitioning into its next phase. But this exchange stood apart, quieter, more personal, and after a brief pause Ethan reached into his inner pocket, not pulling out a contract, not a document, but a simple business card, placing it gently on the edge of the table between them, not sliding it forward, not insisting, just leaving it there as an option, as an invitation rather than an expectation, and Naomi looked at it for a moment, then back at him, her expression unchanged, not impressed, not overwhelmed, just thoughtful, and she nodded once, acknowledging the gesture without rushing to accept or refuse it, and in that moment the balance remained equal, not because power had disappeared, but because it had been redefined, no longer based on assumption but on awareness. And as Ethan stepped back, giving her space, the city lights outside continued their steady glow, unchanged, while inside, something far more meaningful had taken shape, not loud, not dramatic but undeniable, the quiet recognition that value does not announce itself, it reveals itself, often in the moment people least expect to see it. The evening did not end with applause or dramatic gestures, it ended with something quieter, something that lingered long after the last glass was cleared and the final notes of music faded into the background, As the investors filed out with measured steps, their conversations no longer filled with bold projections but with careful considerations, each of them carrying a version of the same realization that what they had almost signed was not just a contract, but a lesson. And Ethan remained behind for a moment longer, standing near the glass wall looking out over the city that had always responded to his decisions without question, yet tonight had offered him something different, not resistance, not failure, but perspective, the kind that does not arrive through success, but through interruption. And behind him Naomi moved through the final rhythm of her shift, collecting what remained, restoring order to a space that had held far more than a simple dinner, her movements steady, unchanged, as if she understood that what mattered had already happened and it did not require repetition. And as she approached the table one last time, her eyes fell briefly on the card still resting where it had been left, untouched, not ignored, but not claimed either, and she paused just for a second, not because she was uncertain, but because she was deliberate, and then she picked it up, not with urgency, not with excitement, but with quiet intention, turning it once in her hand before slipping it into the pocket of her apron, not as a decision but as a possibility. And across the room Ethan turned back, catching that single motion, not as a victory, not as a transaction, but as acknowledgement, a silent understanding that something had shifted beyond the boundaries of business, and he gave a small nod, more to himself than to her, before heading toward the exit, his steps unhurried, his posture unchanged, but his perspective no longer the same, and the door closed softly behind him, leaving the room to settle back into stillness, the kind that follows after something meaningful has taken place. And Naomi stood there for a moment, looking out at the same skyline, the same lights, the same city that had always seemed distant, not unreachable, but selective in who it allowed to be seen. And she did not smile, she did not celebrate, she simply breathed steady and grounded, because she understood something that many in that room were only beginning to learn, that value does not need permission, that intelligence does not need an invitation, and that sometimes the most powerful shift in a room does not come from the loudest voice, but from the one that speaks only when it matters. And as she turned off the final light and stepped into the quiet hallway beyond, the night carried on like any other, but for those who had been in that room, it would never be just another night again.